test-driven meetings. And you speaking of Steve Jobs, you told the story about Steve Jobs coming in and asking people why they were in the meeting.
Right, yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about how, because meetings are an essential part of what we do, but they're the worst part about what we do. But we have to do them.
Yeah.
You know, how have you found making meetings more successful, like this test-driven idea that you shared?
So test-driven meeting was just a joke. Actually, Brian Merrick, one of the guys who signed the Agile Manifesto, called me out. He was like, give me an example, because that's his whole thing. He's got this website called Exemplar.com. So I started giving Brian like concrete examples. Like, you show up for a meeting. This is what that book is called, Insanely Simple, and Jobs would show up and say, why are we here? And then he would ask each person why they're there, and he would politely disinvite people. That's like a test-driven. You're just figuring out how you produce the most value with the least amount of code. So it's something you can imagine. So sort of, this is almost like Dale Carnegie. We're reinventing an old concept. Hey, show up to a meeting with an agenda. Yeah. But an agenda tends to be like more of like a recipe that if you follow it, you'll be successful. And I think if you show up and you say, I call this like the future backwards. It's 60 minutes from now. What does success look like? Mm-hmm. Sort of asking people, say, what is it that we want to accomplish? Because I just sat in so many I didn't know what a big meeting was because I worked at this little company with 13 people for 7 years. Right. And I went into these big companies and there was all this noise. And I was like, oh my God, we're not getting anything done.
No, there's like 30 people on the call.
Right, yeah. And I did that for a bank one time, and the person I was sitting next to was texting, typing, listening to one phone call in her ear and monitoring another one on the phone. And I was like, this just dysfunctional doesn't do justice to what's going on here.
Yeah, but it becomes part of the norm. It becomes embedded in the culture because, like, when you've got these so-called cross-functional teams, the FOMO becomes huge, especially within these leadership brackets within these different departments. It's that they had a meeting about this decision on this thing, and I wasn't a part of it. You know, why wasn't I invited to that? I need to be invited to those things, and then you show up and you didn't need to be there in the first place.
So here's some outrageous examples. In my little DevJam universe, I outlawed the word meeting. Yeah. No one can use that. We're going to call them jams. Yeah. Because you show up for a jam session, and if it's crappy, you stop playing, right? You got to figure out what's going on. And I was like, but we should have more meetings where we're walking around. So I started riffing on, like, what does it mean to, like, walk and jam? And I was like, well, who does that really well? And I thought, oh, well, the best people that do that are those sloppy jazz bands in New Orleans. So in South Minneapolis, we used to call it a Mardi Gras. Yes. And so we would have some of our best discussions walking around. Yeah. It's also kind of good for you.
It is good for you.
One of the acquisitions I worked at in San Diego for a large company, after they came out of meeting, someone would publish the cost of the meeting. So, and a lot of people were really freaked out about that, but it was be like, you know, if 40 people are on the phone call, that meeting gets really expensive really fast. And if you're trying to, like, wean it down, well, that's pretty parochial. Yeah. That's a way to sort of get people to say, what's the value of what?
I look at, and I've had this conversation with the executives before where they've called them $1 million meetings, right? It's like, why are we having this $1 million meeting? And I turn around and I say, yes, why are we? Because you are driving a lot of these decisions. You know, I know you don't like this. Yeah. I know you've said, well, I've hired you people to figure this thing out. You know, we're still incentivized by the things that you put in front of us to say this is what a good job looks like. Mm-hmm. So I ask executives all the time to hold up the mirror first before they go out and start judging their teams and say what incentives are you providing, right? Or you're mandating with these folks that is driving this behavior. You know, not just they don't know what they're doing. These are very talented individuals, right. You know, but the way that they're being used and the way that they're being incentivized will sometimes turn people into complete animals.
Right. You know, and think of that, like, you know, so that we don't get too far into executive bashing. One of the things I struggle with is teams, these agile teams. Mm-hmm. Like, well, we don't have the people here. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go get the people. If I get the people in this room, you got to remember that these people have a lot of stuff going on. So an hour is a big deal. So when they show up, bring the money. Yeah. Just don't kind of stumble around. Really in fact, publish the questions that you want to talk about before they get here, because a lot of them are going to look at it on the way. They walk in the door and boom, you can sort of start, because a lot of the people that are high value in meetings are being torn, the product space. Yeah. What I saw with, like, most of the product people, whether it was XP or Scrum or whatever, is a lot of them would say, I can't go sit with the team. I have a real job to do. And I would say, okay. And I would try to understand that and not just kind of run them over. And I would realize a lot of them had to be out talking to the market. They were doing all this stuff you and I are talking about. So they couldn't be highly available to the team. And this idea of the product owner was busted from the jump. Because if you get any kind of bandwidth going on, you can't have one person and the team.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Scrum was sort of naive about this idea of the product owner will show up with these ideas, the team will take the ideas and work on them in a Scrum, so that in a sprint. So it's great that the team has ownership, but if the team doesn't have concept, it doesn't matter how passionate they are.
Right.
You know, they could just be wandering around in the woods, finding the most interesting sticks.
Right, exactly. Hey, I got one. No, that's not the one I want. Yeah, we used to say this, where people would be like, go get me a rock. No, not that rock. These developers are making decisions in the micro, as they're going through and making those code. If they don't have that context, they're going to make bad decisions every time. If they don't understand what the ultimate, and I hate to use the word, but holistic goal that they're trying to achieve, they're going to make bad decisions in those micro moments when they're commenting this one line of code that later could create X amount of tech debt and all these different things, right?
Right, and there's so many great parts of that. How can we ask people to make interesting, discrete decisions when they don't have, and here's the metaphor they usually use, the big picture.
Yeah, sure.
A frustrated, passionate technology person will say, I don't see the big picture. And when someone says that, man, you need to kind of respond.
Yeah.
Even if whether it's perception or fact. If that person doesn't have context, no way are they going to make interesting decisions. And no way are they going to be able to innovate and kind of say, hey, have you thought about this?
Yeah.
Because they can't really see. Now, I think...
Well, you're setting them up to fail.
Yeah, and where that really came in harshly in the Agile space is we had people designing for the future. And when the future changed, they got the solution that no one needed. But that doesn't mean you kind of say, hey, don't worry about where we're going. Just look 100 feet down the road and be happy in the car. We're going to get there on time, and you're going to love it when we get there. It's like, well, first of all, I got to pee at some point, and I might want to eat. So I'm not going to hold you to lunch at 12:16, but could you kind of give me some idea where we're going?
Right.
Yeah.
So if you've got multiple teams, and you touched on this earlier, where you maybe have these different teams, where have you found good success in promoting learning across teams?
I've drawn these crazy whiteboard pictures for a while that I should have published somewhere because I don't think anyone's really talking about the more complex problems that I see, and the more, especially complex, but complicated as well, exist across teams, across time. And when there's multiple teams working in 3 sets of technology, there's only one product backlog. Those other things are just parts, whatever component teams, whatever you want to call them. And arbitrarily assigning people and saying, you're the product owner on Team X, it's arbitrary. A product company would go, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Now, you could say that search is a product, but that's like a full stack thing that you and I can own. We can improve the search that has direct impact on customers. If I'm on the SAP team and you're on the mobile team, and so sitting between us is some geeks on the Java team, the customer doesn't give a crap about any of that stuff, and they got to cut all the way through it, and we need to give those groups, a subset of people from those teams, context at some frequency that allows them to be able to make interesting decisions. And so one of the models I've looked at quite a bit in the last few years is the military, because they figured out this Agile stuff a long time ago.
They sure did.
In fact, it's super funny. I might have said this before you saw, is that the Romans said the right-sized team was 8. Scrum came along 2,000 years later and said 7 plus or minus 2, which is hysterical, right? But that doesn't mean you just have 100 groups of 8, because that doesn't scale when you're trying to solve complex dynamic problems, which is, I think, that back to our first discussion, that's the scary part in the product space, is it's dynamic and it's uncertain, and those are things that most people don't like, especially people that are investing. Yeah. The irony, though, of the people in the financial sector that aren't looking at the uncertainty about their investments when they invest in software projects, it doesn't get more ironic. That's awesome. Right. So I think that showing people that there's a frequency and a cadence of a subset of people, some of which are on teams and some of which are across teams, that's usually what I try and do, is set up that cadence, and the more informal I can do it, the better. Now, out at Thomson Reuters, when they rebuilt Westlaw, they built this thing called Westlaw Next. We did that pretty formal. We had at first we had 60 people, and we had a subset of people that would meet, and there was people that were thinking about cross-cutting concerns, security, concurrency, architecture, user experience. And they would sit with the people that were the leaders on the teams. so that those people could get that context and then bring it back to their team. And then we set up sort of a frequency for them to connect across those teams, but not to do status reporting. Here's what I did yesterday. Here's what I'm doing today. To really talk about, hey, when we planned this, we thought that I was going to consume this from you and we were going to have this API between the two of us, but it's not working out. The frequency is wrong. The granularity, the signature is wrong. So now you have like sort of product-driven architecture. That I think is a cool concept. So that was a long answer.
No, it's
That's
great.
Actually the stuff that I'm trying to write about right now. And I was pretty far down a path writing this thing for O'Reilly. And I thought it was going to be about product discovery and product delivery. But the more I wrote about it, I kept kind of segmenting, saying, well, if you have one team and one product, blah, blah, blah. But if you have many teams and one product. And so I reorganized the information to say, if you have this little ideal state of one team and one product, then you can sort of slam discovery and delivery almost on top of each other. But when you have segmentation that cuts across technical boundaries, and I keep using this SAP Java mobile one because I see it in all these big companies.
It's a lot.
You just can't dynamically just shove those over the top of each other because the JavaScript wonks are going to go a lot faster than the SAP people.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of figure out what's your slowest moving thing and set up a feedback loop around that.
If you're waiting for those teams to just figure that out on their own, that's a problem. And that's why I keep going back to the executives and what they need to do to be able to empower those teams to start really talking to incentivize them to be talking with each other.
Did you hear about this book, Turn the Ship Around?
No.
So it's probably worth like just kind of listeners thinking about. It's written by a commander of a ship that was kind of saying, when the ship is running well, especially when a ship is docking, lots of people are involved. But if it goes well, the commander does nothing.
Yeah.
In the military, the Marines reorganized themselves maybe 15, 20 years ago, maybe less, to introduce this concept called commander's intent. Now, that might be something we could try to get some executives to latch onto. Your job is to not tell people how to do it. Your job is to tell them what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And that book, I think that guy's probably just making a gajillion dollars talking to leaders right now. He's really inspiring.
Right. Well, and that's where I find ultimately, and I could go on for days about this, but the problem with people thinking a list of features is a vision, and which I run into over and over again. I mean, I remember walking into a very large organization and they said, well, we're good. We already have our roadmap. And I said, this isn't a roadmap. This is a list of features over time. And they were like, what's the difference? And I was like, well, I'm not seeing what the impact is. Like how much, what percentage is your business going to X amount or whatever? Like, what's the business impact according to each of these features that you called them? And they were shocked. They were like, but I was speaking your language.
Yeah.
I was like, I appreciate that, but that's
probably that's probably the answer to one of your questions is you and I need to go in and what seems obvious to us is not obvious. Just like continuous integration wasn't obvious. I was talking to an exec at a local company here in 2002 about XP, blah, blah, blah. I'm just ranting on and on about it. After about 5 minutes, he says, what does that have to do with an operating system? And I was like, that's not dude's fault. That's my fault. So we need to figure out a way to keep introducing language to those people. I wrote this blog once called When Will It Be Done? Because I think that's what we've given a lot of leadership is tell me when it will be done. Well, that's not necessarily their fault. It's one big lump investment. They don't get that we can do incremental investment and invalidate things and spend money in a more interesting way. And we can't talk to them about points and Scrum and Sprint. No. That ship has sailed, I think.
I talked to like a good mid-sized startup not too long ago, and they don't even have something like Mixpanel or something in their system because they've just been so heads down getting stuff out. And don't get me wrong, they're talking to the customer, they're iterating, they're doing all these things, but they're not gathering as much data as they could be. So going back to what you were saying about the customer journey, I wanted to ask, let's unpack that just a little bit because I want to understand what your idea is. Is it that I'm marking a point in the future of this new customer behavior and then backtracking it? Obviously with like ... after it, like this will continue. This isn't the end state. But is that kind of what you're talking about when you're talking about how I'm going to present that to my development team?
Yeah. I want to say one thing. Think about what you just said is so brilliant. Like what happens when analytics become first-class citizens like automated tests? That's the next step. Then we'll start practicing impact-driven development. So
makes sense.
I want to build something. I think I know something about you. I'm pretty sure you want to do it. There's all sorts of things you could do in this thing I'm building. So I make some guess, some choice. I don't think everything's a guess. I'm a little bit down on sort of that language because I think it dumb